Today on What is Tabletop, we talk about skills. Let's talk about skills, baby. Let's talk about you and
Charles,
me.
wait. We can't afford the copyright strike. We're too young. We're too fresh to this. We don't have any money. We can't afford for Salt and or Peppa to come down on us.
That's a shame.
Hello and welcome to What is Tabletop, where I, Frank, am going to get completely destroyed because Charles can't stop singing.
I like to sing. It's fun.
And that's why he's a bard. Anyway.
Which is funny. I've never played a bard in any of your games.
No, I know, and he never will if I have anything to say about it. Anyway, what are we talking about today, Charles?
Today we're going to be talking about skills. There are many games that include skills, obviously, but we want to focus on the skills as a whole. So, Frank, what are the pros and cons of having skills in a game?
Well, before we even talk about the pros and cons, don't fail your skill check in liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. We're so close, or have already passed 1,000 subscribers. We can't tell the time or future, and if we tried to, pretty sure we get like egg on our face when that happens, right, Charles?
Yeah, I'm not good at predicting stuff.
You should ask him about how the Super Bowl prediction went, right, Charles?
Yeah, I did really well.
He lost and had to name his character Blurg.
I did.
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons of skills in a game, Frank?
So, first of all, skills are those little bucks of things that have like very specific descriptions telling you what you can and can't do. So, for example, the skills tend to make a game more roleplay heavy. The biggest example of this is D&D, because if you took the skills out of D&D, which you really could, it becomes a combat system. And, I mean, let's be honest, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons is basically a combat system, and the skills are just there to imply that there's role-playing happening, when in actuality, there's not much to the idea of, like, creating your character for the sole purpose of role-playing in that regard. Now, going back to our class versus skills systems video, which you can watch at some point, at any point you want to, and give us more views, we would appreciate it. We talked about how class-based systems tend to be more focused on combat, skill-based systems tend to be more focused on role-playing. So that's kind of like the big discrepancy between the two. So the nice thing about skills is that you can take some like very niche ideas and make it very important to your game, right? If you're going to include a skill like investigation, then that means looking into mysteries, solving riddles, stuff like that is very important to your game. If you don't include a skill like deception or persuasion, that means social interaction is not important to your game, and you can take that out. So the more skills you include, the more variety there can be, which can mirror real life in that way. It might not in other ways. Also, you could have very few skills, implying these are the only things that matter, kind of like what Candela Obscura and Blades in the Dark do, where there's so few skills that you're starting to understand, like, okay, I have control, which could be this, or this. And that's kind of the downside to skills sometimes, is that you can have skills that are too vague. Like, if people don't know what coercion is, they're going to be like, wait, okay, so I want to persuade this guy. Cool, we don't have persuade in this system. We have coercion. It's like, okay, but is that a good thing? No. Charm is the nice one. Coercion is the mean one.
And again, you have that connotation of, like, yeah, you're right. Coercion, not a nice thing to do to someone.
Right. And then you can have things like guile or subterfuge. Yeah. And it's like someone just opened a thesaurus and decided we're going to pick this one because no one else has picked it before. Yeah. But then you can get people who are like, I'm still confused. What is sabotage? Is that actually like socially used, or is that more like physical? Can I only sabotage machines? I don't know what this means.
Or can I sabotage relationships?
That's where it would be social in that situation for sure. Yeah. And so like, that's the downside of skills, is that it can be confusing at first to be like, I got to remember which of these skills does which of these things.
Right.
Ultimately, the benefit of skills is that you can make a good variety of character options that are hopefully all viable in the system.
Let's talk about the different types of skills and skill checks specifically. So let's talk about the granddaddy of them all, Dungeons & Dragons.
Basically, it's the rolling higher. That's the skill check you're going for. So you take a modifier and you add it to your roll, and then you're trying to beat a big number. Yeah. And as the game goes on, as you level up, do all these things, just like in Pathfinder and D&D, your number gets bigger, which means you're more likely to be successful on it. The downside to rolling high is that you then have to be really good with your dice math in order to make sure that like progression feels natural. You definitely don't want something that seems impossible to be done by a level 2 character. right?
That's fair.
Like if your DC is a 30 and you have a D20, that means they should not be able to get a plus 10 to their skills well into like later levels.
Right.
And so that can be the difficult part, is if you don't know the math properly, if you're not able to do things. Like that is the big issue with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. It's very easy to make a level 1 character who can roll with a plus 10 out the gate. And it's like, oh, cool. Well, I'm just going to succeed at everything ever, all the time.
I know with the rogue characters, those are like those skills are easy to get plus 10 if you know what race and what class and
well, and then you get
know.
multiple in that too.
Yeah,
which isn't necessarily a bad thing if that's the point of the rogue. But then the rogue is also really good in combat, and then the rogue is also like just able to do so many other things. So like to make the rogue a skill monkey as well as very viable in combat is interesting choice, because it just makes it to where it's like the rogue is one of the better options to always choose.
It's a little broken in that aspect.
Yeah.
Again, one of my favorite characters to play is the rogue because of that. Not because of that reason specifically. I like knowing that I've got a better chance of like playing stealth and you know being more subterfugey, getting away with things.
Now, conversely, the downside again of if you have low numbers in your roll to hit a certain threshold is that you could occasionally have the time where the person who's not competent at something becomes hyper competent because of the dice, right? So like the joke of the wizard can't figure out this riddle, but the barbarian did. Everyone always talks about that because it does happen.
Yeah.
And obviously people will talk about, well, you can't make everybody roll for everything, this or that.
Yeah.
But like still luck does play a factor into that. And if you haven't done your math properly, it's going to cause the game to be a little wonky. And if you're not okay with that kind of randomness, it's not always as fun.
I'm sure there are ways around that too, though, because I know if I were playing it, I would argue that the barbarian would have to hit a higher DC than the wizard.
Yeah, you could do that. Some players may feel like you're kind of literally moving the goalposts depending on players, which does suck. That's why I like Pathfinder's version of this a lot better, where you like add your level to it. Now, that was the original Pathfinder. Pathfinder 2 has like thresholds where it's like if you're a novice at something, you get a +2. But if you're at this level with a skill, you get a +4. And so it's more about like increasing the skill gets you those bonuses rather than just natural progression, which is interesting and does help a lot with the role-playing aspect of it.
The more you talk about Pathfinder, the more I want to play it, because that's one of the games I haven't played yet. So
yeah. Now, conversely, you could be using 2d6 or anything that's multiple dice where it becomes a bell curve rather than just an equal amount of any number. And so if you do that, the math becomes a lot easier to mitigate for. So like in Traveler, you're rolling 2d6 and an average target number is an 8. So if you know that 2d6 on average tends to yield a 7 at the most, you know that, okay, if I want to be good at something or an average at something, I need a +1 at it in order to be average at it. Like consistently average at it. And so there's something nice about that in those kind of bell curve dice games where you can have smaller numbers and it does work a little bit better in that regard.
Yeah, I know we're playing Traveler right now, and I learned a bit in character creation. I should have stayed in there a little bit longer.
Yeah, that is the interesting thing about some skill-based systems is that Traveler, you can keep pushing further and further. There's a higher risk that something could happen to your character, but then you have a chance of getting more skills. Very fitting for a game where it's like, oh yeah, the older you are, the more knowledgeable you are, but that means you might have some physical issues or this or that, which is super interesting. But yeah, that is the downside if you don't do that.
All right. What about games like Fallout?
Yeah, so that is the same thing, but in the reverse.
Okay.
So you're actually rolling lower than a threshold rather than above. And you might be wondering, that's kind of lame. If you haven't played it, it's actually arguably better than rolling above because the math is so much simpler. So if I'm rolling with a D20 and I want to succeed 50% of the time, I need to roll a 10 or lower in order to succeed 50% of the time. Super simple, easy to do, right? Now, what you do in those systems usually is you'll take an attribute, some sort of, in Fallout, it's specifically one of the special skills, and then you take one of your tag skills, and you put the number together, and that's the target number you need to hit or lower. If I'm really good at lasers, right, laser energy weapons, I get that number higher, it makes my chance of succeeding with that kind of a check higher, because again, I'm adding that number to another number, my intelligence. I get a 13. I need to roll 13 or lower in order to succeed. So that's super simple to understand. The math is really easy. You can then do things like Fallout does where you cap a skill at 6. Like you can't get higher than a +6, and then your attributes can't get higher than a 9, which means you can never do better than a 17, which is fine. And that makes sense. You still have some room for error. There's still a chance that you could do bad, but ultimately you're usually going to do very well with that kind of stuff. And so rolling under is actually arguably a better version of rolling higher, and doesn't have to have these big modifiers to make it more or less likely for something to happen.
It feels more achievable. Like whatever you're rolling for, it feels a little more achievable because you've designed your characters in such a way that you want them to succeed. In those aspects.
It just works out a lot better in my opinion, for sure.
All right, what are some other kind of skill checks we got going on?
There's also the combining features together. So a lot of skills in certain systems will be like, for example, if we're talking about D&D, because that's the most people are going to be coming from there before they use other RPGs.
Of course.
You're going to have athletics is strength plus if you have proficiency in athletics. That is your athletic skill. Some games, such as Vampire, Traveler does this as well, will do things where it's you have a skill and you're proficient in that skill or you're good at that skill. And then you take that skill and add any of the other attributes that you can justify to this role to make it work. In Traveler, for example, there's 3 different athletics you can do. There's strength-based athletics, endurance-based athletics, and dexterity-based athletics. So instead of having like this awkward thing of like, well, athletics is used for running really fast, but then acrobatics is from leaping from place to place. And it's like, well, couldn't athletics be leaping? And then couldn't acrobatics actually be doing this or that? Right? Where, again, we get into like the confusing nature of like the thesaurus just kind of being used for so many different things. You can have it where it's like, okay, I need to be able to do this depth-defying feature that does require a little bit more dexterity. I'm going to roll athletics, and I'm going to add my dexterity modifier to it. Or this is more about enduring some sort of physical trial. So that means it's my athletics and my endurance, which is great. It's also nice because it kind of helps your players to just role-play and like improv and like think on their feet, where they're like, I'm really good at persuasion, but my social standing is really bad. Oh, can I somehow use intelligence to persuade? Sure. Tell me how you do that. Okay, I'm going to talk about things clearly above this guy's head to make him be like, you know what? I just don't want to talk to you anymore. Get it going. So you can persuade someone by sounding super hyper intelligent, right? Which is kind of fitting for how the world works.
You have the players kind of justify their actions with the appropriate skill.
Right.
Okay, you want to convince someone to do something, but you don't have great social skills. Use the intelligence use your intelligence instead. That's good. That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, like I think we did Hunter the Reckoning at one shot, and someone was trying to break into a roof, and there was a lock on the roof. So he had to use larceny in order to pick the lock, and he failed using like his intelligence and his larceny. And so then he's like, "Oh man, I wish I could just break the lock." I'm like, "Okay, that's larceny and strength." Right? Cuz you're trying to break into something. That's the larceny skill, but you're using your physical power to break it rather than your mind to break it, which I think is a really interesting way to do it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's one more skill check that we have on our list.
Yes, and that is usually found in a lot of rules light games. We've talked about Crunch, if you want to watch that video. But rules light games are very roleplay heavy. They're super into that. And what they tend to do is something very unique where you can write in a skill rather than having a select list of things you could do for. The benefit of this is obvious. You can be like, my character is really good at something that's not normally on a list of skills, right? So if I'm playing D&D and I'm like, oh, my guy's a architect. I'm really good at building houses. What skill is that in D&D? Investigation? Not really. Like, is it this or that? It's like, I don't know. But like in City of Mist, I can be an architect. That's part of my normal human persona. And so I can write in blueprints as a skill. Yeah. Like I'm really good at blueprints. And so then the beauty that comes out of that is like we talked about with the last thing, where you can try to justify using this niche skill, but somewhat vague thing. So like my character comes across the blueprints to a place. So I can use the skill for blueprints to analyze the blueprints to this place that we're trying to break into. So now that's benefiting the party while also fitting into what my character can do. The downside is if you do not have players who are good at coming up with unique things that can then also be used in multiple different ways, it's gonna be really awkward because usually you end up getting players who go too niche where they can barely use it, or you have players who go too narrow that could be used too much.
Yeah. It makes me think of actually Kids on Bikes. There's something called Knacks. that players can have. And basically, the knack is just something it's like a go-to skill. It's not listed or anything. It's just something you're good at. And no matter what you do, you get it. You don't have to roll for it. You have an automatic 10.
Right.
So depending on what the skill check is, you could just automatically succeed. If it's 10 or lower, you automatically succeed on it. So
Yeah. And again, it's a really cool thing. But if you have power gamers, power gamers are most likely to try to find a way to make it broad enough that they can use anything. Like we played City of Mist, and Jeffrey had one where it was like basically something about hitting something. Like I get angry, and it's like, cool, I'm getting angry, so I get to add a +2 to this attack. And then it's like, okay, you don't get to do that every single time.
Yeah.
It's like, but I'm angry every time I do it. And it's like,
he was being too broad.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so like that's the downside, is that they can be too broad, or you can have, again, like we said, the too niche, where it's like, well, actually my character is really good at geography pertaining to the Mediterranean Sea during the years of 1776 to 1842.
Why you got to call me out like that, Frank?
Listen, I'm just saying that last character you made was a little weird.
It was based on a historical figure.
What's nice about this kind of thing is that you, as the designer, don't have to come up with a list of skills that have to be used in every situation. The downside is, again, sometimes you then have a system where it's like, if it's not obvious what the kind of system and theme is that you're going with, your players might not know what kind of skills are going to be very important to go with.
Yeah, I know I struggled with the City of Mist a little bit too. I mean, like you don't know what is, because sometimes you don't know, like, is this too niche or is this too general? I wanted mine to be more based on luck, and it was, and you were like, that's good, but it's still a little vague because it wasn't. So yeah, it was one of the things where, again, love the game. I enjoyed it wholly, but it was just one of those things where it's hard to come up with things like, unless you've seen it played or if you've got more of a point of reference. So I think that would have helped me out more, because again, I like looking at things. I'm like, oh, cool. Because I like to borrow from things if I can.
Yeah, I think that's where, like, if you can have a system where it's like, here's some examples, but you encourage the players to come up with your own. I think that's really good. That, because I think Daggerheart, when we were doing the playtest, was also like that, where you guys were like, I just don't know what to write here.
Right.
And like, what is that even, like, how does this pertain to anything? I think we, in the City of Mist example, we ended up going with, it was like things that are unlikely to happen.
Yeah.
And that was fun because you tried to justify it a few times and I could say no. Right? Where you were like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm like, no, that's actually feasible. That actually makes sense that it could happen. So you will not be able to add that as your modifier.
And I appreciate that you did that for me too, because again, it gave me a structure, allowed me to, as a player, to. So, and I know some of you guys may look at that like, oh, that seems kind of really. No, GMs need to give their players structure, because you don't want your players getting away with everything.
Right, because then it removes the tension. Right, we talked about that in one of our videos, where it's like, if you're not even rolling for dice, what even is the point of playing the game? Because it's like your actions don't mean anything. You're just going to always succeed. So you don't want the inverse, where it's like, I'm always going to have such a big modifier that I'm always going to succeed. So again, like, what's even the point of rolling dice?
So let's talk about group checks.
Yeah, here's the thing that will inevitably happen in any campaign or setting or RPG that you use that has skills. Everyone's going to want to make a check at the same time about the same thing. This can come in multiple forms. It could be something like the party decides that they want to stealth away, right? They want to, all together, all 7 of them, or however many people, are going to sneak out of the city or sneak into the city or whatever it is they might be. Conversely, you might have something where it's like, this is a knowledge check. Okay, well, our wizard is the smart one. Oh, he failed. I would like to go as well. Right.
Yeah.
The adding on to this check until inevitably someone gets it, which, like, again, if you have 7 players, even if you have 4, like, the inevitability of someone succeeding gets higher and higher the more players you have, because that's just how dice work. So obviously you want to have some sort of methodology to make it to where it's like, no, this is an individual check versus this is a group check.
So I know I like in Dungeons and Dragons where we would do the group checks. Basically, you would say you would have to have this many successes versus this many failures.
Yeah, so that comes from 4th edition. That is a skill challenge. And what it does is you set up, like, you want a lot more successes than failures.
Right.
And you give the players a few set of skills they can use. And if you're me, you allow them to use any skill you want at least once. Because that, again, allows for creativity and your players to come up with some wacky stuff. Typically, what ends up happening is your players are going to want to use the skills they're good at. So if you're, like, in a street chase, obviously athletics and acrobatics are going to be 2 skills you can use constantly. But let's say this is 4th edition and someone's like, I have Streetwise. Could I use Streetwise to be able to be like, okay, I know where this street cuts off and this and that? Yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead and roll. And so what you do is you roll, You see if they beat the DC or not. If they succeed, that's a success. That goes into the success mark. If it's a failure, and like the natural tension that comes from that is really good. I always have far less successes or far less failures than successes because it just makes like the like we can't lose. Also conversely, I think if you guys like succeeded by like 10 or more, I give you 2 successes. If it was a nat 20, I give you 2 successes, stuff like that. Helped to mitigate it when it would be like, you have to get 15 successes before 3 failures.
Well, then you also had it where if you rolled a negative, if you rolled a 1, it was 2 failures. So again, I appreciate that. Okay, what about majority rules? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is the one that I think most people default to when they're going to come up with it. So this is we're all going to stealth. Okay, everyone make a stealth check. All right, what did you guys get? 14, 13, 17, and 2. It's like, okay, I don't know. The DC was 15, so like I guess 3/4 of you fail. Therefore, the majority fails. Therefore, everyone, including the person who did really well on their stealth check, all get caught. Now, sometimes what you'll see happen is everyone rolls and the DC was, let's say, 10. And so 3 of them succeed and the person who rolls a 2 fails. And then the group still fails because one person did, which is also kind of a feels bad moment where it's like, yeah, that guy didn't make a stealth check. And so that's why if I'm doing this version, I always do majority rules or at least half of you have to succeed.
Yeah.
We've had that happen a few times where it's like someone just rolled really bad. But someone rolled really well. So like we had a situation in our one shot where I think you rolled really well and then Foster the rogue rolled really bad on stealth.
Yeah.
And so we were able to make it to where it's like, no. I, being so stealthy, am able to help your stealth out. Right. And so it's like I figure out this piece of armor is clinging together, so I like take it apart or something like that. That's usually how I tend to do majority rules type things. But ultimately, I'd rather do skill checks if you're going to do something like that.
Right.
The only time I do it is really stealth. Is like a majority rules type thing in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about Traveler task chains. What are those?
So in Traveler, they have a very interesting mechanic that is called task chains. And basically it's this chart that they use to say what was the last skill that was used in this set of skills, right? So let's say the party is in their ship and they just want to get from point A to point B. There's several different skills that could be used in the process to get there. Maybe you need a comms check to be able to talk to some sort of communication device and say, hey, are we clear to make this jump? Cool. Then you need an astrogation check to navigate yourself there. Then you're going to need an engineering check, maybe, if your ship took some damage. And then finally, you're going to need the pilot check. That's 4 different skills right there. So this is a skill chain. And what happens is you will make the first one. Depending on how well you did here, will determine the modifier used for the next skill. So for example, let's say your comms check goes out. And your comms guy does really well. And he's able to be like, hey, we're going to make this hyper jump. Are we clear to land? Yes, you are. Depending on how well they do, can it give the next skill a +1, +2, +3. And then that skill, plus all of their other things, is now more likely to succeed because of how well the other one did. But let's say that one failed. Now the next skill is a -1 or a -2. And the penalties, again, are severe enough because it's a 2d6 system, but not so severe that it's like crippling. So like ultimately, if the pilot check is the most important one, how well everyone else does eventually has some sort of bearing on how well the pilot does. Yeah. And like we've kind of done that before in like D&D where it's like, okay, if you do this, that's going to give this skill advantage or this one or something like that. So it's not hard to translate it to other systems where it's like this person did well on this check. So that means your check, which is the more important one, is going to get a +2, something like that.
Yeah, no, I like how that flows too. Cause you know, the logistics of it, you know, okay. We're navigating to this, uncharted area,
right?
You know, so, I roll really poorly on, you know, engineering, but someone rolls really well on navigation or astrogation, you know, like, so maybe, you know, even though I did poorly on it, you know, there's still an opportunity for success, which is really nice because everyone likes to succeed.
Yeah. The hard part can be if you don't know how the skills all like chain together, being able to come up with a reason where it's like, how the heck did someone sweeping the deck make it easier for you guys to jump into light space? I don't know, but maybe that meant that there was a piece of trash that didn't fly to your eye. I don't know.
I use intimidation. My large Torg uses intimidation to scare the living daylights out of the engineers.
Oh man, I got to tell you about something. So there was one time in my friend Brett's campaign where he had a version of Resurrection where everyone had to make a skill check. Everybody could make a skill check to contribute to the final roll. So it's kind of like skill chain.
Yeah,
to some
of course.
extent. And he would just let anyone make any check. And so Zach Brooks had a character who had like a plus 24. This is Pathfinder. A plus 24 to his acrobatics. And he's like, oh, I really hope you come back. In fact, you coming back would make me leap for joy. And then he makes a backflip. And he's like, can I use that? Brett's like, sure. And he's like, cool, that's a 47. It was a really high number. He's like, of course that helps. And I'm like, that's the downside of skills, right? Is oh, I'm really good at this thing. Can I somehow use flipping to help with the fact that our friend died?
That was a GM decision because
Yeah,
I would,
100%.
again, I don't know who Brett is. I love him for being open like that. But I, who's Mr. like, sure, I let a lot of things happen. If you could justify it. If Brooks should have justified that with me, I'm like, no, dude, that's not gonna happen.
I think what I would have done is been like, cool, that was a really cool flip. It does nothing to the
yeah, exactly. I think I would have let him go ahead and make the roll without telling him, and then tell him after the roll. Yes, 100%. Yeah, that's the great way to do it.
And again, that's just because we have a good relationship with Zach.
Of course,
I think he would take it well. Where it's like, okay, you can do that. It's not going to count against you, but it's definitely not counting for you. So Charles, out of all the games we played so far, what is your favorite kind of system that we played at this point?
Right now, even though I didn't make the best of my skills in my character creation for Traveler, I'm really enjoying the concept of Traveler. Yeah. Because I know you kind of based it a little bit on the Mass Effect, but like your own version of it. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm enjoying the character I'm playing. I'm enjoying kind of contributing to the lore of your world too. There's a lot of fun to it. And again, the idea of task chains makes me I'm super stoked, for those kind of things. We had a combat last session, which was a lot of fun. Again, my character got really hurt. So, and it's cool. Like, I like that. I like when the stakes are high. Right. So.
Yeah, I think task chains is going to be something I'm stealing for ever. Like skill checks I use in almost any game I can think of.
Yeah.
Task chain is such a simple concept of oh, your character did this thing, that's going to lead into this thing. Yeah, I'm going to give you a +2 or whatever it may be. I think it's such a good concept for sure. I actually like Star Wars. I thought Star Wars was really interesting. Where the idea is you have funky dice. You have your green good dice, and so however many points you have in a skill is how many green dice you roll. But then depending on your attribute that is affiliated with the skill, however many is in that determines how many of those green dice get upgraded. So let's say I'm rolling for stealth. I have 3 green dice in stealth and then 2 in whatever the dexterity, something like that, agility or whatever it may be. I then get 2 yellow dice, which are even better than the green dice, and 1 green die, and then I get to roll that. I thought that was a really cool system. I really enjoyed that. And then my second favorite is probably more like Vampire, where it's like, what combination of things can you use in order to make things interesting and work?
I also enjoyed the City of Mist, where you again, if you're a creative type, it's great. Again, as long as for me, I think it would have been better had I had more experience with it. Next time I play City of Mist, I'll have a better idea of what kind of character I want to play and what kind of skill I want to create. But I like the idea of being creative and coming up with your own unique skill too.
Yeah. And then of course we couldn't, it's the Cthulhu in the room. Call of Cthulhu does skills really well. I'm super excited to actually do a full campaign at some point, even if it's only a few months. But I think Cthulhu does it really well in the sense of everything's on your sheet. How well you succeed or not, just depends on is this a normal success? Do you want to get does it need to be a higher success than that? That's all on your character sheet. And there's so many skills that you can use to where you make such interesting characters. I made a mechanic, but then Dunkerton made a professor, and it's that can cover so many things, and still not all the skills are covered. The downside to that kind of a game is having to come up with all those skills.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's a fun thing to do. We talk about Jeffrey a lot, always being the barbarian. Now I'm thinking about Dunkerton. He's always playing some sort of occultist too.
Not always.
Not always.
Just because in the Traveler campaign he's playing a mad scientist right now, and the last game in the D&D game he was a mad scientist creation, doesn't mean he's typecasted.
Yeah, he was a politician in Star Wars, so I'll give him that.
Yes, actually, that was actually very good.
So he knew that. You could tell Dunkerton knew that system and knew what skills to pick. Oh yeah, he was very because good. When I was dude, we're all how are you rolling so well? I have something where I can replace the die. I'm what? I regret not doing more research into my character.
Yeah, no. It's funny though. I do think when it comes to character creations, you can even find and we're just talking about character creation, so we'll wrap this up real quick. But even in Critical Role, they all have archetypes, right? Like Sam always wants to play a goofy character that has a surprisingly deep backstory. Yeah. Liam plays all the tragic boys you can ever think of. Literally everyone has to have a tragic backstory. And then you have like this or that. Like that's the thing is like no matter how hard we try, there are like tropes that we enjoy. And like if the point is to have fun, might as well, right?
Well, again, if you look at just even in the world of literature, tragic backstories, like that's what it is. Because again, 9 times out of 10, again, this is my made up statistic, but like typically what causes the hero to go on the hero's journey? Usually something tragedy.
Yeah, 100%. And then if you're me, my default is the character seems one way on the surface, but is a completely different thing underneath. And the dichotomy between those two constantly overlapping.
So if we were playing like a Batman TTRPG, he'd be Two-Face.
No, because Two-Face is very obviously. It'd be more like Superman. Where it's
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, like when he's Superman, it's like he's
But the Red Sun version, right?
No, like just regular Superman. No, stop making Superman evil. Okay, I'm done. Charles, just end the episode.
Hey, stay witty. And also, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, tell us we're beautiful, tell us we're not beautiful. I don't care. Stay witty.
Why do they keep making him evil?
All right, that's it.